The bright morning sun spilled through the towering windows of the Whitmore mansion, illuminating the grandeur of the space. Marianne Whitmore, the 78-year-old matriarch of the family, sat alone at the breakfast table in the sprawling kitchen. The porcelain teacup in her trembling hands, adorned with golden vines and tiny blue blossoms, reflected her delicate, time-worn grace. Her silver hair, swept into a neat bun, and her soft pastel blue silk dress gave her the aura of a refined woman who had seen decades of high society. Even surrounded by the splendor of the home she had lived in for over 50 years, Marianne felt out of place, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. The house that had once been filled with love and laughter now felt like a gilded cage. The kitchen, with its gleaming white marble floors and polished black countertops, seemed more like a sterile showroom than the warm hub it had once been. The antique silverware and the pristine linen tablecloth, arranged with precision, were all relics of a time when family meals were moments of connection rather than cold rituals. Marianne sighed deeply, nibbling at a piece of buttered toast she hardly had the appetite for. Thomas always tells me to eat better, she thought to herself, her gaze drifting to the French press coffee on the counter. Jane, the loyal 64-year-old housekeeper, had carefully prepared the meal and would surely be upset if Marianne left it untouched. The tranquil silence of the morning shattered suddenly. The sharp, rhythmic clatter of heels echoed down the hallway, a sound Marianne recognized all too well. Sabrina Whitmore, her daughter-in-law, swept into the kitchen with a dramatic flair that always felt rehearsed. Sabrina, nearly 6 feet tall with a commanding presence, exuded confidence. Her perfectly styled black hair and crimson dress, tight and striking, contrasted sharply with Marianne's understated elegance. Even her jewelry, minimal but clearly costly, caught the light as if designed to draw attention. "Good morning, Marianne," Sabrina sang, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Why are you eating all alone, darling?" Marianne looked up but hesitated to respond. The question was not genuine, it was meant to assert control, to remind Marianne of her diminishing presence in her own home. Before Marianne could muster an answer, Sabrina's voice rose dramatically, echoing through the expansive kitchen. "Thomas! Thomas, come here. Your mother is having breakfast all by herself," she called out, her tone a carefully crafted mix of concern and performance. It didn't take long for Thomas Whitmore to arrive. At 45, he was every bit the image of success his wife loved to flaunt. His tall, broad frame filled the doorway as he stepped in, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit. His slightly graying hair at the temples and warm brown eyes, so similar to his mother's, lent him an air of gravitas. "Mom, why didn't you call us?" "Sabrina always insists we eat together as a family," he said gently, moving to her side with genuine care. Marianne mustered a small smile, her hands resting on the edge of the table. "I didn't want to bother you," she replied quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the tension in the room. Before Thomas could say more, Sabrina stepped forward with a theatrical flourish, wrapping Marianne in what appeared to be a tender embrace. To Thomas, it seemed affectionate, to Marianne, it felt suffocating. Leaning close to Marianne's ear, Sabrina whispered with a venomous edge only the older woman could hear. "So humble, aren't you? But remember, times have changed," Sabrina hissed, her flawless smile masking her hostility. Thomas's phone buzzed, and he excused himself with an apologetic look. "It's the office. I need to take this," he said, stepping out into the hall. As soon as Thomas was out of sight, Sabrina's sweet demeanor dissolved. She leaned over the table, her voice dropping into a sharp, icy tone. "Listen here, you meddling old woman," she spat, her words slicing through the air. "The next time I find you here, maybe I'll make sure you end up in one of those dreadful nursing homes where no one remembers your name. Or better yet, skip a few meals and see how quickly you start to lose your mind." Imagine how worried Thomas would be, seeing his dear mother wasting away. Marianne froze in her chair, her pulse racing. Words caught in her throat as her body betrayed her, leaving her powerless to respond. Before she could even attempt to gather herself, a cheerful voice cut through the tension. "Grandma, didn't Mom say old people aren't supposed to eat in the main kitchen?" Marianne's 8-year-old granddaughter, Evelyn, skipped into the room, her innocent smile belying the sting of her words. The child's crisp school uniform and neatly tied white bows added to her air of perfection, but her words carried the same venom as her mother's. Marianne's trembling hands lost their grip on the teacup, which fell to the floor and shattered with a piercing crash. The sound brought Jane rushing into the room, her face filled with alarm. Mrs. Marianne, are you all right? Jane exclaimed, rushing to her employer's side and placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Thomas. Thomas, come quickly. Mrs. Marianne isn't feeling well. Jane's voice carried an edge of panic as she called down the hall. Evelyn stood by, wide-eyed with curiosity, while Sabrina remained motionless, arms crossed, her lips curled into a faint smirk. Thomas hurried back into the room, his concern evident as he knelt beside his mother. Mom, what happened? Are you okay? He asked, grasping her hands tightly. Marianne's vision blurred as her strength faded. The last thing she saw was Jane's kind, worried face, one of the few sources of genuine care left in her world, before everything went dark. Finally, Evelyn emerged into the room, skipping with an energy that starkly contrasted the charged atmosphere. Her dark hair, neatly tied with white bows, framed a face that bore the same sharp, watchful expression as her mother. It was just a scare, thank God, Thomas said as he sat down beside his mother. He gently took Marianne's hand, his eyes filled with genuine concern. Marianne wanted to smile and reassure him, but the weight of her reality held her back, pressing on her chest like a stone. Do not worry, Mom. We will take care of everything so you can rest. You should not stress about anything, he added, his words meant to comfort but ringing hollow to her. How could she rest when the greatest danger sat right there, only a few feet away? Sabrina, maintaining her soft tone, leaned in slightly as if to inspect Marianne with care. Mother-in-law, you really must take better care of your health. We are all so worried about you, are we not, Thomas? Her voice was like silk, but Marianne felt its sharp edges underneath. Evelyn, darling, come tell Grandma to take care of herself, Sabrina called, coaxing her daughter forward. Evelyn obeyed, her smile innocent in appearance but carrying a hint of defiance that struck Marianne to her core. Old people are like that, Evelyn said in her childlike voice. They get sick over everything. It must be so annoying to be old and weak, huh, Grandma? The words, so cruelly delivered, pierced Marianne's heart. In the background, Jane, the housekeeper, brought her hand to her mouth, her expression a mix of indignation and helplessness. Sabrina, however, merely smiled discreetly, her daughter's behavior a point of pride. Thomas, oblivious to the sting of the moment, glanced at his watch. Mom, I will head to the cafeteria to get you something to eat. Jane, could you come with us? Evelyn, come with Daddy, he said in a practical tone, seemingly unaware of the unease his suggestion created. Marianne froze at the thought of being left alone with Sabrina, her worst nightmare materializing. Sabrina, ever adaptive, interjected smoothly. Of course, darling. I will stay and keep your mother company. I would not want her to feel alone, she said with an impeccable smile that made Marianne's skin crawl. Thomas nodded, none the wiser, and left the room with Jane and Evelyn. The housekeeper hesitated at the door, her expression torn, but she followed her employer's son, leaving Marianne and Sabrina alone. As the door clicked shut, Sabrina shed her mask of sweetness. Her deliberate steps echoed ominously as she approached the hospital bed, her presence radiating malice. Marianne tried to sit tall but felt her strength drain with each passing second. Sabrina leaned over, her dark eyes gleaming with menace. Listen carefully, you meddlesome old woman, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. If you so much as think of opening that shriveled mouth of yours to tell anyone about what happened in the kitchen, high blood pressure will be the least of your problems. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around Marianne's frail arm, her grip unyielding. Those pills you take every night, it would be such a shame if someone switched them for something stronger. Or maybe I will just remind Thomas how often you have been forgetting things lately. Who do you think he will believe? His devoted wife or a senile old woman who can barely find her glasses? Marianne's heart pounded erratically, her hands gripping the bedframe to steady herself. Words failed her as fear gripped her throat. Sabrina's voice dropped even lower, her venom more potent. And do not think for 1 second that Jane can help you. One phone call from me, and her whole family will be out on the street. You have no idea what I am capable of, mother-in-law. And I would love an excuse to show you. A faint sound from the doorway broke the suffocating tension. Both women turned sharply to see Jane standing there, her face pale as she clutched her forgotten purse. Her wide eyes betrayed the shock and fear she felt as she witnessed the scene. Sabrina's expression remained calm, but her gaze sharpened like a predator's. Jane, dear, she said, her tone reverting to its saccharine sweetness. Why do you not help Thomas with the coffee? You know how he loves it when you pick something special for his mother. Jane hesitated, her hands trembling. She cast a helpless look at Marianne, who could only avert her gaze, unable to meet the housekeeper's worried eyes. With no other choice, Jane nodded and retreated. Oh, and Jane, Sabrina called out, her voice honeyed but her intent unmistakably cruel. You know that little house where your family lives? It would be such a shame if something happened to the contract, would it not? The door closed with a finality that sent chills down Marianne's spine. Hours later, the drive back to the Whitmore mansion was weighed down by an oppressive silence. The golden light of the late afternoon, which usually cast a warm glow on the estate's grand facade, now seemed to stretch unsettling shadows across its marble walls. Marianne, still pale and weak from her episode at the hospital, leaned on Jane as they walked slowly through the main corridor. Their footsteps echoed in the vast space, each sound a reminder of the tension simmering beneath the surface. Thomas, distracted by messages on his phone, disappeared into his office without a second thought, delegating Marianne's care to Sabrina and Jane. Marianne's heart sank as she realized the danger of being left alone with her daughter-in-law. The Whitmore mansion, a marvel of Italian design, once symbolized the family's unity and prestige. The high ceilings, ornate crystal chandeliers, and priceless artwork now felt like bars in a gilded cage. As they reached the hallway leading to Marianne's quarters, Sabrina followed close behind, her stiletto heels striking the marble floor like the steady rhythm of a predator closing in on its prey. I'm sure you're wise enough to keep quiet, Sabrina said, her voice dripping with venom. After all, we would not want anything unfortunate to happen to those precious little grandchildren of yours, would we? She emphasized the word precious with a possessive tone that pierced Jane's heart like a dagger. Jane froze, her legs trembling under the weight of terror. Her hands, worn from decades of loyal service to the Whitmore family, clutched Marianne's arm as if it were her last hope. The gray uniform she always took such pride in now felt suffocating, a noose tightening with every word Sabrina uttered. Please, Mrs. Sabrina, Jane whispered, her voice cracking like shattered glass. My grandchildren, they're just little ones. The youngest is only 3 years old, and he needs his asthma medicine. My daughter is expecting another, all alone. That little house is all we have. Please, have mercy. Tears began to stream down Jane's face as she fell to her knees, her dignity of decades forgotten in the face of Sabrina's cruelty. We've served your family for 3 generations, she pleaded, her voice faltering. I helped raise Thomas, and I practically brought up Evelyn. Sabrina's smile widened, savoring the moment as though it were the finest delicacy. She moved closer, her heels tapping a cruel rhythm against the marble floor. With an air of mock sympathy, she crouched to Jane's level and lifted her chin with a perfectly manicured finger. Anything, she asked, her voice sickly sweet. Jane's lips quivered, and she nodded, too terrified to speak. Then I suggest you keep that mouth of yours shut, Sabrina said, her tone hardening. Unless, of course, you want your precious family to find out what it's like to live under a bridge. Rising to her full height, Sabrina turned her attention to Marianne. Stepping closer, she leaned in with a malicious glint in her eyes. And you, mother-in-law, she began, her voice soft but edged with steel, after so much stress, I think you might need a special little remedy to help you sleep. You know, I've been reading up on medications for the elderly. It's fascinating how some of them can leave someone sleeping for days. Others, she continued, her finger tracing the edge of a small pill bottle hidden in her dress pocket, can even cause permanent confusion. Marianne gripped the stair railing beside her, struggling to maintain her balance as the threat washed over her. Imagine you sleeping so deeply you couldn't tell Thomas about our little chats, Sabrina whispered. Or waking up so confused no one would believe a single word you say. Wouldn't that be wonderful? A very deep rest, mother-in-law. The sound of small footsteps broke the suffocating tension. Evelyn appeared, her expression angelic but her gaze unsettlingly sharp. Mom, can I give Grandma her medicine today? She asked sweetly, her innocent tone masking the learned cruelty in her words. Marianne's blood ran cold. What else had this child absorbed from her mother? Sabrina let out a low, satisfied laugh, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Of course, my love. Who knows, maybe one day you'll help Mommy with everything in this house, too. The sound of male footsteps approaching signaled a shift in the scene. Thomas, followed by Graham, a guest Marian recognized from past dinners, entered the hallway. "Darling, where are you?" Thomas called, his voice animated. "Graham just arrived." Hearing the name, Sabrina's posture changed in an instant. The cruel glint in her eyes disappeared, replaced by a radiant smile. She adjusted her hair and smoothed her dress, transforming herself into the picture of a devoted wife. "We're here, dear," Sabrina replied in a melodic voice, gliding gracefully toward the men. The shift in her demeanor was so dramatic that Marian felt a knot tighten in her throat. Taking advantage of the distraction, Jane tried to guide Marian toward her quarters. Before they could move, Sabrina intercepted them with a commanding gesture. "No, no," she said lightly. "We'll all go together. After all, we're a family, are we not?" Marian tried to protest, but her voice failed her. Evelyn clapped her hands excitedly, adding to the illusion of a harmonious family moment. Jane hesitated, making one last attempt to shield her mistress. "Mrs. Marianne is very tired. Perhaps she should rest before lunch," she said cautiously. Sabrina's eyes flicked to Jane, her smile unwavering but her gaze sharp enough to cut. "Nonsense," she replied with artificial sweetness. "She'll love the company. And Graham has always been so close to the family." The word "close" carried a weight that made Jane's stomach churn. Marianne remained frozen, her strength sapped. Graham, tall and impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, exuded casual confidence as he approached. "Dear Graham," Sabrina exclaimed, her voice dripping with charm. "How wonderful to see you. We were just taking Marianne to freshen up before lunch." Her smile was warm, but Jane noticed the subtle glint in her eyes, a look that lingered on Graham just a moment too long. As the group moved toward the dining room, Evelyn sidled up to her grandmother. "Grandma," she whispered with a saccharine tone that hid malice, "if you don't behave at lunch, Mom said she'll give you a medicine that will make you sleep all day." The child's words cut Marianne deeply, though they were spoken with the innocence of a playful threat. Meanwhile, Graham, oblivious to the underlying tensions, walked beside Thomas, their conversation centered on business matters. Sabrina, leading the group with Evelyn at her side, seemed more in control than ever. Jane trailed behind, her watchful eyes darting between Marianne and the others, praying silently that nothing more would unfold during the impending lunch. The false calm that enveloped the room was palpable. Graham sat at the desk, his posture controlled, but he resembled an actor rehearsing his lines more than a man at ease. Lunch had ended only minutes ago, and Thomas, distracted by business matters, had hurried upstairs for a video conference. This fleeting interval was exactly the moment Sabrina and Graham had been waiting for. As soon as Thomas disappeared, Sabrina shut the office door behind her with a deliberate click, the sound reverberating through the silence like the opening note of a sinister symphony. She walked toward Graham, her stiletto heels tapping steadily on the polished wood floor. Each step seemed calculated, every movement rehearsed to radiate authority and control. The fitted red dress she wore caught the last rays of daylight streaming through the window, making her appear almost ablaze in the dim room. Her black hair, cascading in perfect waves, framed her face like a crown, while her eyes, dark and unreadable, were locked on Graham with a predatory focus. "Did you bring everything?" Sabrina asked, her voice low but brimming with authority. Graham's practiced smile stretched across his face, though it never reached his calculating eyes. From his sleek Italian leather briefcase, he pulled out a crisp brown envelope. "The life insurance documents are here," he said, placing the envelope on the desk with exaggerated care. His tone was smooth, but an undertone of satisfaction betrayed his excitement. "Now all we need is his signature on the final form. And, of course, to ensure that your dear mother-in-law does not interfere." Sabrina's expression hardened in an instant. Leaning over the desk, she closed the space between them, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "That old woman is already suspecting something," she spat. "And Jane, that meddlesome maid, has been watching me far too closely." At the hospital today, Sabrina broke off suddenly, her head snapping toward the door as her sharp ears caught the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. For a moment, the office was silent, even Graham holding his breath. Then the soft shuffle of slippers echoed faintly outside. Sabrina quickly straightened, her composure snapping back into place like an actress stepping into character. The door creaked open slightly, revealing Evelyn's small figure, perfectly dressed and impeccably poised. Her dark eyes, so much like her mother's, gleamed with curiosity, but there was a shadow behind them, something unnervingly knowing. "Uncle Graham," Evelyn said sweetly, her voice innocent but carrying a weight far beyond her years, "are you really giving Daddy a special surprise?" The words hung in the air, deceptively innocent. Graham's tense shoulders relaxed slightly, and he forced another smile. "Of course, dear," he replied, his voice dripping with affection. "A gift Daddy will never forget." Sabrina's gaze flicked to her daughter, a mix of pride and calculation lighting up her expression. She crouched down, bringing herself to Evelyn's level. "My love," she said in a sugary tone that masked the ice beneath, "why don't you go check on Grandma? Make sure she's taken her medicine, you know how forgetful she's been." Evelyn beamed at her mother's suggestion, the malice in her eyes unmistakable. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, Jane's figure appeared at the edge of the hallway. The housekeeper's gray uniform seemed to blend into the shadows of the late afternoon, but her presence was unmistakable. For a moment, Jane and Sabrina's gazes locked. Jane's eyes were wide with fear, but Sabrina's held nothing but contempt. Graham, sensing the tension, began hastily gathering the papers on the desk, his previously controlled movements now rushed and sloppy. "We need to be more careful," Graham muttered, tugging at his silk tie. His nervous glance darted toward the hallway. "Thomas cannot suspect anything until everything is finalized." Sabrina remained unfazed, her lips curling into a faint smile that chilled even Graham. "Do not worry about Jane," she said in a low, deliberate tone. "I already have plans for her and that pathetic little family of hers. Soon, she will not be a problem anymore." Her words were so cold, so devoid of humanity, that even Graham, accustomed to Sabrina's ruthlessness, seemed to flinch. Evelyn, still standing near the door, tilted her head. "Mommy," she said sweetly, "can I help make Jane go away, just like we're going to help Daddy rest forever?" The pride in Sabrina's face was unmistakable as she caressed her daughter's cheek. "Of course, my angel," she replied, her voice dripping with affection. "You're learning so quickly." At that moment, the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, plunging the office into deep shadow. Graham, visibly shaken, fumbled to turn on the desk lamp. The circle of yellow light illuminated only their immediate surroundings, casting grotesque shadows on the walls that seemed to reflect the true nature of the scene unfolding within. "The life insurance is at its maximum value," Graham whispered, as if fearing someone might overhear through the walls. "And with the changes we made to the will." He trailed off as Sabrina raised a hand, silencing him. Her sharp senses seemed to pick up on something beyond Graham's awareness. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Thomas was returning. In an instant, Sabrina transformed. Her steely demeanor melted into the warm, devoted wife she had perfected. Turning to Evelyn, she smiled sweetly. "Dear, why do you not go play in the garden? Uncle Graham and I need to finish planning Daddy's surprise party." Evelyn nodded obediently, though she cast one last curious glance at the documents on the desk before slipping out of the room. Sabrina's attention shifted to the hallway, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. She knew Jane was still there, hiding, her presence betrayed by the faint glow of a phone screen. "Jane, dear," Sabrina called softly, her voice honeyed yet venomous. "Why don't you come in? I have been researching some wonderful nursing homes, just in case your family ever needs a new start." Jane froze, her trembling hands clutching the phone that had recorded the entire exchange. Her heart pounded as she realized the danger she had put herself in, but she remained hidden, hoping against hope that Sabrina would not act on her suspicions, yet. "I have been learning so much about nursing homes," Sabrina said casually as she paced the room, her fingers lightly adjusting the pillows on the bed as if preparing for a guest. "Some even have special wings for patients with mental difficulties. You know, those who start hallucinating, imagining things, accusing innocent people of mistreatment." Her gaze flicked sharply toward Marianne, whose stomach churned at the implication. Evelyn, watching with unsettling curiosity, piped up. "Mommy," she asked with childlike innocence, "is it true that when old people get really confused, they need stronger medicine?" "Yes, darling," Sabrina replied, stroking her daughter's hair with delicate fingers. "Sometimes, when they refuse to cooperate, we have to help them understand that it is for their own good. Isn't that right, mother-in-law?" She turned her icy gaze to Marianne, her eyes meeting her mother-in-law's reflection in the vanity mirror. Marianne's hands trembled uncontrollably, and the glass she held slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the marble floor into countless shards, the spilled water reflecting the lamplight like a scattering of tears. "So clumsy, Grandma," Evelyn remarked, her sweet voice tinged with venom. "I think Mommy is right, you really do need special care." The naturalness with which the child delivered the comment was as chilling as the words themselves. Sabrina stepped forward, her heels crushing the shards beneath her with a resounding crunch that echoed through the room. She bent down, picked up a fresh glass from the silver tray, and filled it with water. "Do not worry, my sweet old lady," she said softly, her voice laced with menace. "We have all night to make sure you take your medicine." The distorted shadows cast by the lamp stretched across the walls, amplifying the suffocating atmosphere. Marian sat frozen, aware that she was entirely at the mercy of her daughter-in-law's calculated cruelty and her granddaughter's budding malice, which should have been a source of joy in her life. The city awoke under a soft breeze, rustling the bougainvillea leaves in the Whitmore mansion's garden. The sky painted itself in hues of pink and gold, a serene spectacle that starkly contrasted with the darkness of the previous night's events. The mansion's light stone facade and intricate wrought iron details stood as an imposing testament to its grandeur, but within its walls, tension simmered. In the garden, Jane carefully carried a silver tray with breakfast, her steps deliberate as she navigated the pebbled path winding between flower beds. Every step felt weighted by the burden of what she knew. A faint sound made Jane pause. It was a muffled sob, nearly inaudible but unmistakable to her. She had heard that same sound many nights before, emanating from Marianne's room like the laments of a trapped soul. Now, the sobs seemed to come from the gazebo at the far end of the garden, shaded by flowering vines. Jane's heart ached as she recognized the source of the sound. Approaching the gazebo quietly, she found Marianne curled on one of the white wooden benches. The matriarch looked smaller and frilier than ever, her once pristine blue silk robe now appearing too large for her hunched frame. Trembling hands clutched an embroidered handkerchief as she tried in vain to wipe away the steady stream of tears. In the morning sunlight, the droplets reflected like tiny prisms, an ironic contrast to the despair etched into her face. "Mrs. Marianne," Jane called softly, hesitant to disturb the moment. "You haven't eaten anything today." She stepped closer, her movements cautious, as though approaching a wounded bird. The tray she carried held fresh coffee, soft bread, and neatly arranged fruit, a meal meant to comfort but now a stark reminder of emptiness. Marianne looked up, and the sheer terror in her eyes made Jane's stomach tighten. The older woman's frail hand gripped Jane's arm with surprising strength. "She's going to send me away," Marianne whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "She said she'd convince Thomas I'm crazy. She talked about horrible places where no one would hear me scream." Jane felt her throat tighten. She set the tray down on the small table and sat beside Marianne, momentarily breaking the unspoken boundary between mistress and servant. "Mrs. Marianne," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This cannot go on. We have to tell Mr. Thomas, he must know what is happening before it is too late." Before Marianne could respond, a child's voice cut through the air. "Grandma's talking to herself again," Mommy said, Evelyn sang, her voice laden with false innocence. The girl stood at the entrance to the gazebo, her pristine school uniform and malicious smile mirroring her mother's. Jane immediately stood, reverting to her servile posture, but the damage was already done. Sabrina emerged behind her daughter, her emerald green silk ensemble shimmering in the soft morning light like a serpent's skin. Her face, as always, was impeccably composed, but her eyes carried the venom that Jane feared most. "Darling, what a fright," Sabrina cooed as she approached, her steps firm yet graceful. Her voice dripped with false concern. "Wandering around the garden all alone after all your recent episodes." Marianne tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her. Jane instinctively reached out to help, but Sabrina's sharp gaze froze her in place. "You should rest, sweetie," Sabrina continued, leaning closer to her mother-in-law. "Thomas and I were just discussing getting you some professional help, places where they can take good care of you." The sound of footsteps on the stone path drew everyone's attention. Thomas appeared, his erect posture and impeccable navy blue suit cutting a striking figure against the lush garden backdrop. His expression was a mix of confusion and concern. The sunlight reflected off his glasses, obscuring his eyes, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. "Daddy!" Evelyn cried, running toward him with exaggerated sweetness. Grandma was talking to herself again, and Jane was here with her, just like that time Mommy said they were plotting something. Sabrina glided over to Thomas, effortlessly slipping into her role as the devoted wife. "Darling," she began, her voice as smooth as silk. "We need to talk about what is best for your mother. I am only trying to help, but—" Her words trailed off, her tone carefully calibrated to plant seeds of doubt. Marianne's heart sank as she saw her son's hesitation, the carefully spun web tightening around her. "I think we need to talk about your mother," Sabrina said, casting a fleeting glance at Marianne, her voice carefully measured to convey concern. "It has been some time now that I have noticed troubling behaviors." Jane remained motionless, clutching the handkerchief Marianne had dropped earlier. In the pocket of her apron, the phone containing the damning recording of Sabrina and Graham's conversation felt like both a weapon and a curse. She glanced at Marianne, who looked small and helpless, her usual strength buried beneath layers of fear. Thomas approached the gazebo slowly, his eyes fixed on his mother. For a moment, doubt flickered in his expression, a spark of realization that something was amiss. Sabrina noticed the change as well, her confident demeanor faltering for a fraction of a second before she quickly masked it with a warm smile. "Thomas," she said, attempting to draw his attention, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Before he could respond, the sharp ring of his phone shattered the tense silence. Glancing at the screen, he sighed. "It's Graham," he muttered. "It must be about the business we discussed yesterday." With that, he walked away, phone pressed to his ear, his voice fading into the distance. The momentary silence that followed was heavy, as though the air itself had thickened. Sabrina remained still, her gaze lingering on Thomas until he disappeared from view. Then, her smile shifted. The false concern melted away, replaced by an expression cold and calculated. She turned her attention back to Marianne and Jane, her eyes gleaming with malice. The web Sabrina had woven was not yet complete, but Jane could feel the threads tightening. She clutched the handkerchief in her hand like a lifeline, knowing the recording on her phone could upend everything, or doom them all. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the Whitmore mansion's grand living room, casting fragmented patterns of light that danced across the antique furniture. The intricately carved chairs, upholstered in muted gold, seemed to shimmer in the kaleidoscope of color. Yet the room's beauty was a thin veneer over the tension that charged the air. Sabrina and Graham sat on the deep red velvet sofa, their proximity too close for propriety, like co-conspirators basking in the glow of their schemes. Graham's dark gray suit was perfectly tailored, a stark contrast to Sabrina's emerald green dress, which glimmered faintly in the filtered light. The faint, cloying scent of Sabrina's expensive perfume mingled with the woody aroma of Graham's cognac. On the marble coffee table, a crystal glass rested beside neatly arranged documents and an unlit cigar. The room, once a hub for family gatherings, now felt tainted, a stage for the sordid secrets being plotted within its walls. "The plan is flawless," Graham murmured, leaning back on the sofa. His eyes gleamed with unbridled ambition. "The life insurance has been increased to $5 million. No one will suspect a heart attack in a man as stressed as Thomas." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, as if toasting his anticipated victory. His fingers brushed Sabrina's as he set the glass down, a silent test of their shared complicity. Sabrina leaned in slightly, her elegant posture betraying none of the intensity in her voice. The fabric of her dress slid against the velvet sofa, creating a faint whisper as she spoke. "Before that, we need to eliminate the obstacles," she said, her tone low and deliberate. Her dark eyes locked onto Graham's, a quiet storm brewing within them. "Jane is becoming a problem. That meddlesome maid has seen and heard too much." Sabrina leaned closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Her eldest son works security in one of the roughest neighborhoods. Imagine the tragedy if he had an accident on the job. And the younger one, the single mother, imagine the despair of having no home for her baby. "As for dear mother-in-law," she added with a bitter smile, "I've been looking into public nursing homes in less reputable areas. Places where people disappear without a trace, and no one asks questions." Graham hesitated, his smile faltering as a shadow of doubt crossed his features. He poured himself another glass of cognac before speaking. "And the admission?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Is the doctor ready to certify her dementia?" Sabrina's lips curved into a satisfied smile. "All arranged," she said smoothly. "Dr. Garcia is cooperative when the price is right. Once Thomas is gone, it will be easy to convince everyone that his poor mother went mad with grief." A textbook case of emotional collapse. She laughed softly, the sound brittle and sharp, like a crystal on the verge of shattering. The eerie melody of a piano interrupted their exchange. Evelyn, dressed in a frilly lilac gown, sat at the grand piano near the corner of the room. Her small hands slid clumsily over the keys, producing a fragmented tune that echoed the disorder simmering beneath the mansion's polished exterior. Graham turned his head toward the child, an odd mix of concern and paternal care softening his features. "And what about the girl?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Isn't she too young to understand all of this?" Sabrina's expression hardened momentarily before melting into a smile of twisted pride. "My little one is learning well," she said, gesturing elegantly for Evelyn to join them. "Come, darling. Tell Uncle Graham what Mommy taught you about old people." Evelyn approached gracefully, her curls bouncing lightly as she moved. Fixing her dark eyes on Graham, she spoke in a clear, sweet voice. "Mom says old people are useless, Uncle. They just get in the way and need to be removed." The small smile that spread across Evelyn's lips was chilling in its resemblance to her mother's, a carefully cultivated reflection of Sabrina's influence. Before Graham could respond, Evelyn's attention shifted. Through the ornate Venetian mirror on the wall, she spotted a figure partially obscured by the heavy silk curtain. Ambrose stood at the entrance, motionless, his face a mask of shock as he watched the scene unfold. Evelyn continued, oblivious to her father's presence. "And Uncle," she added brightly, "Mom says that after Daddy goes to heaven, we'll be very rich. Grandma will go to a special place where no one will believe her stories." The sound of breaking glass shattered the moment. Ambrose's phone slipped from his hand, hitting the marble floor with a sharp crack. Sabrina and Graham turned toward the noise, but Ambrose, driven by instinct, silently retreated down the hallway before they could see him. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of what he had overheard began to sink in. In the living room, Sabrina rose from the couch with a practiced fluidity, smoothing her dress as if nothing had happened. "Speaking of your father," she said casually, "we need to finalize the preparations for tomorrow's special dinner. It will be unforgettable." Her words carried a veiled promise only Graham understood. Meanwhile, Ambrose leaned against the wall in the hallway, his breathing uneven. 20 years of marriage, decades of friendship with Graham, all of it felt like a lie. His daughter's innocent yet damning words echoed in his mind, "Mom says that after Daddy goes to heaven." From the living room, the clinking of Graham's glass and Evelyn's childlike giggles mingled with Sabrina's laughter. It was a sinister symphony that revealed the truth Ambrose had been too blind to see until now. The faint ticking of the wall clock echoed through the room, each beat aligning eerily with Ambrose's racing thoughts. He sat at his desk, usually a place of focus and productivity, now a space filled with turmoil. His green eyes, typically calm, stared at a spot on the polished wood surface, unfocused as his mind replayed his daughter's chilling words, "After Daddy goes to heaven." The phrase, delivered with unsettling sweetness, carried the weight of a truth he could no longer ignore, a conspiracy brewing within his own family. His hands trembled slightly as he rifled through drawers, searching desperately for something tangible to confirm the gnawing suspicions in his heart. Each paper he touched seemed heavier than the last, as though the documents themselves bore the burden of his family's fate. When the clock struck 11, Ambrose's search bore fruit. His eyes landed on a life insurance policy in his name, its value astronomically higher than what he remembered authorizing. His stomach churned as he scanned the details, noting with horror the date of the alteration, coinciding precisely with the start of Sabrina's frequent business meetings with Graham. Ambrose rubbed his face with both hands, trying to stave off the crushing weight of realization. His breath caught as he spotted the final blow, his own signature, forged with uncanny precision. He recognized the strokes, the slant, the pressure, a near-perfect imitation only discernible to the person who had made them countless times. With shaking hands, he continued his search, urgency growing with every passing second. From a hidden compartment in the desk, he pulled out something even more damning, bank statements revealing suspicious transfers to unrecognized accounts, all made by Graham in the past few months. Alongside them was a folder containing fabricated medical evaluations, documents that painted a false picture of a progressive illness Ambrose had never experienced. The sound of footsteps in the hallway froze him in place. For a heart-stopping moment, Ambrose thought it might be Sabrina, but the cadence was different, hesitant, cautious. The door creaked open, and Jane stepped inside, her uniform wrinkled and her face etched with worry. "Don Ambrose," she whispered, her voice trembling, "There is something you need to know." Ambrose gestured for her to enter, quickly closing the door behind her and locking it with a decisive click. Jane's fear mirrored his own, her hands wringing the hem of her apron as though it could ground her. "Jane, please," he said, his voice hoarse. "Tell me everything. No matter how terrible it is." Decades of loyalty bound the two in a moment of raw honesty. Jane took a deep breath and pulled a cell phone from her pocket, her hands trembling. "I have a recording, Don Ambrose," she began. "It's of Senora Sabrina and Don Graham. They were in the office earlier today." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as though expecting someone to barge in. Encouraged by Ambrose's reassuring nod, she tapped the screen of her phone. The audio began to play, Sabrina's voice cold and calculated, as familiar as it was alien. "The poison can't be detected. It will look like a heart attack," Sabrina's voice declared, her tone disturbingly casual. Ambrose felt his body stiffen. Graham's voice followed, calmly discussing details as if planning a dinner party. The occasional laughter woven into their conversation only magnified the horror.